"Stay down, old man, or you'll get it again." The words, sharp as shattered glass, echoed through the brightly lit aisle of Henderson's grocery, bouncing off the stacked cans of peas and corn. 90-year-old Arthur Jenkins lay on the cold linoleum, a searing pain, alien and terrifying, coursing through his thin frame. The acrid smell of ozone, the scent of the taser's discharge, filled his nostrils, mingling with the mundane odors of floor wax and ripe peaches. He'd just been reaching for his wallet, a slow, deliberate movement from a body that had seen nearly a century of sunrises. He'd wanted to pay for his pumpernickel bread and the small carton of milk, his weekly essentials. Now, the world was a blur of fluorescent lights and the polished black boots of the young officer looming over him, a figure of absolute, unquestionable authority. His hip ached where he'd fallen. Disbelief warred with a deeper, older instinct. To remain still. To endure. If you believe every soul, especially those who have served, deserves dignity, type honor in the comments. Arthur Jenkins was a man woven from the threads of quiet routine and unspoken history. He lived alone in a small, tidy bungalow on Elm Street, a house that, like him, had seen better decades, but still stood resolute. Mornings were for weak tea and the newspaper, afternoons for tending the small patch of roses. His late wife Martha had adored, and evenings for the crackle of the old radio. His movements were measured, careful, betraying the stiffness in his joints, but not the iron in his spine, an iron forged in crucibles he never spoke of. Neighbors saw a gentle, reclusive old man, perhaps a little frail, always polite. His voice, soft, his eyes often distant, gazing at something beyond the neatly trimmed hedges and familiar picket fences. They didn't see the shadow of the young Marine who had stormed beaches under impossible fire, nor the leader who had brought his men home against all odds. They saw only the faded blue of his cardigan, the slight tremor in his hands, the stoop in his shoulders, the ordinary camouflage of advanced age. Today, like every Tuesday, was grocery day. He'd put on his cleanest, though threadbare, windbreaker, checked his meager shopping list, and set out with his worn canvas tote, unaware that this ordinary errand would spiral into a vortex of indignity and a shocking public reckoning. The air in Henderson's grocery was cool, a welcome respite from the early summer humidity. Arthur navigated the aisles slowly, his cane tapping a gentle rhythm on the polished floor. He wasn't in anyone's way, or so he thought. The trouble began near the checkout, a sudden whirlwind of youthful impatience and authority. Officer Miller, barely 3 years on the force, was responding to a call from a nervous cashier who'd misinterpreted Arthur's fumbling in his deep coat pocket as something suspicious. Perhaps he was trying to conceal an item, she'd stammered into the phone, her voice laced with the thrill of minor drama. Miller, eager to prove his mettle, arrived with an air of brisk importance, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered taser. He saw Arthur, old and slightly disoriented by the sudden confrontation, and his mind, already primed for suspicion, leaped to a conclusion. "Sir, I need you to show me what's in your pockets." Miller's voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of refrigerators and checkout beeps. Arthur, his hearing not what it once was, blinked. I beg your pardon, officer," he asked, his voice a reedy whisper. "Your pockets, old man. Empty them. Now." Miller's tone brooked no argument. He was young, armored with the certainty of his uniform, and perceived Arthur's slowness not as a product of age or confusion, but as defiance. Other shoppers began to notice, a small knot of curious onlookers forming at a safe distance. Whispers rustled like dry leaves. "What's going on? Is he stealing?" Arthur, flustered, tried to comply. "I was just my wallet to pay for my bread." His hand, trembling slightly, moved toward his inner jacket pocket, the one where he always kept his worn leather billfold. It was a familiar gesture, practiced thousands of times, but to Officer Miller it was a furtive movement, a potential threat. "Hold it," I said. "Empty your pockets. Hands where I can see them." Miller's voice escalated, his posture stiffening. The air crackled with tension that was wholly disproportionate to the scene. An elderly man, a loaf of bread, and a carton of milk. Arthur froze, his hand hovering near his chest. Confusion clouded his eyes. He wasn't a threat. He hadn't been a threat to anyone in decades, not since he'd laid down his rifle for the last time. I don't understand," he stammered, his bewilderment palpable. "It's my money. For the groceries." He tried to explain, to bridge the chasm of misunderstanding that had opened so suddenly between them. But Officer Miller wasn't listening. He saw an old man not complying, an old man arguing. In his training manual, that was a red flag. "Sir, I am giving you a lawful order. Show me your hands and step away from the counter." Miller's voice was louder now, attracting more attention. The store manager, a harried man named Henderson, hurried over, his face a mask of concern and apprehension. "Officer, is there a problem?" Henderson asked, trying to de-escalate. Miller shot him an annoyed glance. "Stay out of this, sir. This is police business." He turned back to Arthur, his patience clearly exhausted. "Last chance, old man. Comply, or I will make you comply." Arthur's mind, usually so clear despite his years, felt muddled. The officer's aggression was like a physical blow. He felt a tremor of fear, not for his safety, he'd faced far worse, but for the sheer, bewildering injustice of it. He was a citizen, a taxpayer, a man who had lived his life by the rules. What had he done? He made a final desperate attempt to retrieve his wallet, to prove his innocent intentions. "Please," he whispered, his hand inching forward again. "It's right here." That was the moment Officer Miller made his decision. He saw not an elderly man fumbling, but a suspect resisting. He saw not confusion, but defiance. His training, or perhaps his temperament, kicked in. The crackle of the taser was shockingly loud in the confined space of the grocery aisle. Arthur felt a sudden, agonizing pain, an invisible lightning bolt that seized every muscle in his frail body. His legs buckled, the loaf of pumpernickel and the carton of milk scattered across the floor as he collapsed. A cry torn from his throat, a sound of pure shock and agony. He landed heavily on his hip, the impact jarring through his old bones. The world tilted, the faces of the onlookers swimming above him, distorted masks of horror and surprise. "Stay! Down, old man, or you'll get it again." Miller's voice, now laced with adrenaline, boomed over him. Arthur lay there gasping, the metallic taste of fear and ozone in his mouth. His worn leather wallet, dislodged by the fall, skittered a few inches away from his outstretched hand, flipping open as it did. Inside, nestled beside a faded photograph of Martha, was a small, tarnished metal pin, a miniature set of paratrooper wings, intricately detailed. And beneath it, almost hidden, a small dark blue enamel badge with a single silver star. It was a unit insignia, rare and almost forgotten from a special operations group disbanded decades ago. No one noticed it immediately, except perhaps a young stock boy named Kevin, who had been quietly watching the unfolding drama with wide, horrified eyes. Kevin, a history buff and an aspiring Marine reservist, felt a strange tug of recognition at the insignia, something he'd seen in an old documentary. He couldn't quite place it, but a seed of unease, deeper than just the horror of the tasing, began to sprout. Officer Miller, meanwhile, was cuffing Arthur's wrists behind his back, the cold metal biting into his thin skin. "You're under arrest for resisting an officer," Miller announced, his voice tight with self-justification. The store manager wrung his hands. "Officer, are you sure? He's just an old man." Miller scoffed. "They all say that. 6 minutes. That's all it took. 6 minutes from the moment Arthur Jenkins hit the cold linoleum floor to the moment the familiar guttural roar of heavy engines filled the air outside Henderson's grocery." Inside, Officer Miller was radioing for transport, his report clipped and official, painting Arthur as an uncooperative, potentially dangerous subject. Arthur lay still, the initial shock giving way to a profound weariness, a deep, aching sorrow that transcended the physical pain. He closed his eyes, his mind drifting not to the present indignity, but to distant shores, to faces of young men who had trusted him with their lives. He heard Martha's voice, a gentle echo, telling him to be strong. The young stock boy, Kevin, had edged closer, his eyes fixed on the fallen wallet and the strange pin. A flicker of memory, a name. Marauders? No, that wasn't quite it, but something like it, something elite. He'd seen the officer's aggression, the old man's bewildered fear. Something felt terribly wrong. On a hunch, a wild, improbable impulse, Kevin pulled out his phone. He had an uncle, a retired Marine Master Gunnery Sergeant. He'd once told Kevin, "If you ever see a real injustice, especially to one of our own, you make noise. You make it loud." Kevin's fingers trembled as he dialed. "Uncle Joe? It's Kevin? You're not going to believe this." He quickly recounted what he'd witnessed, describing Arthur, the tasing, and, crucially, the pin he'd glimpsed. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Then, a string of terse questions. Kevin described the pin again as best he could. A long silence. Then Uncle Joe's voice, suddenly hard as granite, "Stay there, son. Don't let them move him, if you can help it. I'm making a call. What's the address?" "Outside." The first engine sound was a low rumble, then another joined it. And another. Shoppers, peering through the front windows of Henderson's, gasped. 2, then 3, then 5, olive-drab high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicles, Humvees, were pulling into the parking lot, their movements precise, professional, utterly out of place amidst the minivans and sedans. They weren't parking neatly in the lines. They were forming a cordon, effectively, methodically blocking the entrance and exit to the lot. Doors opened, and uniformed Marines began to disembark, their bearing erect, their faces impassive but radiating an unmistakable aura of disciplined power. They moved with a purpose that brooked no interference, securing the perimeter. Officer Miller, mid-sentence with his dispatcher, heard the commotion. His radio crackled with confused queries from other units about the unexpected military presence. He looked up, annoyed. "What in the Sam Hill is going on now?" he muttered, striding toward the front of the store. The sight that greeted him stopped him dead in his tracks. The parking lot was no longer a civilian space. It had the distinct feel of a military staging area. And walking toward the entrance of Henderson's grocery, flanked by 2 imposing Marines in full-dress blues, was a man whose presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere. He was tall, his uniform immaculate, adorned with rows of ribbons that spoke of a long and distinguished career. On his shoulders, the silver stars of a major general gleamed. His face was stern, etched with lines of command, his eyes like chips of ice. Major General Marcus Thorne did not pause, did not hesitate. He strode into Henderson's grocery as if he owned it, his gaze sweeping the scene, taking in the cowering onlookers, the distressed store manager, Officer Miller, standing dumbfounded, and finally the frail figure of Arthur Jenkins, still lying on the floor, cuffed. The general's eyes, cold as they assessed Miller, visibly softened for a fraction of a second when they rested on Arthur. He then focused back on Miller, his voice low yet carrying the unmistakable weight of command that could silence artillery. "Officer," he began, his tone deceptively calm, "explain to me, precisely and immediately, why a decorated hero of the United States Marine Corps is in your custody on the floor of a grocery store." After being subjected to an electroshock weapon, Officer Miller, who had puffed his chest out to assert authority moments before, seemed to shrink. The name tape on the general's uniform read Thorne. The stars on his shoulders were undeniable. This was not some local reservist. This was the real deal. High command. "Sir, General, sir," Miller stammered, his face paling. This man, this individual, he was resisting arrest, failure to comply, suspicious behavior. General Thorne's eyes narrowed. Suspicious behavior? Resisting arrest? This man is Arthur Jenkins. Does that name mean anything to you, officer? Miller shook his head, utterly bewildered. No, sir. Should it? The general took a slow, deliberate step closer, his voice dropping further, yet each word was like a hammer blow. Officer Miller, Arthur Jenkins is not just an old man. He is Sergeant Major Arthur Ironman. Jenkins retired. He is one of the last surviving members of the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion. He holds 2 Navy Crosses, 3 Silver Stars, 5 Purple Hearts. He personally saved the lives of over 30 men at the Chosin Reservoir by holding a pass single-handedly for 6 hours against an enemy battalion armed with little more than a bayonet and sheer courage, after being wounded 3 times. He has advised presidents. He has trained generations of Marines, myself included. The pin in his wallet, which I presume you didn't bother to look at, is the Raider stiletto. He is a legend within the Corps. And you, officer, you tased him for trying to buy a loaf of bread. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. The store manager looked like he was about to faint. Kevin, the stock boy, felt a surge of vindication so strong it almost buckled his knees. He had been right. Officer Miller's face had drained of all color. He stared at Arthur, then back at the general, his mouth agape. I didn't know, he whispered, the arrogance completely gone, replaced by dawning horror. You didn't know, General Thorne repeated, his voice laced with icy contempt. That is precisely the problem, officer. You didn't know. You didn't look. You didn't inquire. You saw an old man and you assumed the worst. You escalated a situation that required patience and respect, not aggression. You assaulted a man who has given more to this country than you can possibly comprehend. He gestured to the 2 Marines accompanying him. Sergeants, kindly assist Sergeant Major Jenkins. The 2 Marines moved swiftly and gently. They knelt beside Arthur, their movements full of a reverence that was deeply moving. Sir, permission to remove these restraints? One of them said, his voice respectful, addressing Arthur, not Miller. Arthur, still dazed, nodded slowly. The cuffs were removed. They helped him sit up, then carefully, tenderly to his feet. One Marine retrieved Arthur's cane. The other, his fallen groceries, handling the pumpernickel bread as if it were a sacred artifact. General Thorne turned back to Miller, whose entire demeanor had crumbled. Your chief will be hearing from me directly, officer, as will Internal Affairs and the district attorney. This display of incompetence and disrespect is an insult not just to Sergeant Major Jenkins, but to every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform of this nation. You are a disgrace. Miller could only nod, his eyes downcast, the shame radiating from him in palpable waves. He looked small, insignificant, stripped bare of his authority by a power far greater and more legitimate than his own. The other shoppers, who had initially been curious or fearful, now looked at Arthur with a mixture of awe and profound regret for their own silent complicity. Some had tears in their eyes. Arthur, supported by the 2 young Marines, looked at General Thorne. A flicker of recognition, a ghost of a smile, touched his lips. Marcus, is that you, son? His voice was weak but clear. General Thorne's stern demeanor broke for a moment, replaced by a look of deep affection and concern. It's me, Arthur. We came as soon as we heard. He gently placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder. Let's get you out of here. We have a medical team waiting. As they escorted Arthur Jenkins out of Henderson's grocery, a path seemed to clear magically before them. The onlookers parted like the Red Sea, their faces a mixture of astonishment, shame, and newfound respect. The Marines outside snapped to attention as Arthur, flanked by the general, emerged into the sunlight. A captain from the medical team hurried forward with a wheelchair, but Arthur, drawing himself up with a visible effort, waved it away. I can walk, he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its old timbre. He leaned on his cane and on the steadying arm of the young Marine beside him, and walked with quiet dignity toward one of the waiting vehicles. Officer Miller remained inside, utterly alone in the aisle, the discarded taser cartridges glinting on the floor like malevolent eyes. The store manager finally found his voice. "Officer," he said, his tone trembling with barely suppressed anger, "you need to leave. Now." The news of the incident at Henderson's grocery spread through the town like wildfire, then further, amplified by social media posts from stunned witnesses. Officer Miller was immediately suspended, pending a full investigation, an investigation that General Thorne personally monitored. The chief of police issued a public apology to Arthur Jenkins and to the community, promising retraining for officers on de-escalation and dealing with vulnerable populations, especially veterans. Henderson's grocery offered Arthur a lifetime supply of free groceries, an offer he politely declined. Though he did accept their heartfelt apology, the resolution was more than just disciplinary action and public statements. It was a shift, a small but significant recalibration of awareness in the community. People started looking at their elderly neighbors a little differently, wondering about the hidden stories, the unheralded sacrifices. The local VFW post, which Arthur had quietly supported for years, saw a surge in new memberships and donations. Young Kevin, the stock boy, received a personal commendation from General Thorne and an open invitation to visit the Marine base for a tour, his path to the Marine Corps now clearer and more inspired than ever. Arthur Jenkins, after a thorough checkup, he had a badly bruised hip and some scrapes, but his spirit, though battered, was unbroken, returned to his quiet bungalow on Elm Street. The next Tuesday, he walked to Henderson's again. This time, the store manager greeted him at the door, personally escorted him through the aisles, and insisted on paying for his pumpernickel and milk. Other shoppers smiled, nodded respectfully, some even stopping to thank him, not for anything recent, but for things long past, things they were only now beginning to understand. The roses Martha had loved seemed to bloom brighter that week. The world hadn't changed, not entirely. But a small corner of it had been reminded that heroes often walk among us, disguised by age and humility, their greatness hidden in plain sight. They ask for nothing, but they deserve everything, starting with our respect. The incident served as a stark, dramatic lesson. Never judge a book by its cover, for within the most unassuming binding might reside a story of unimaginable courage and sacrifice. The image that lingered was not of Arthur on the floor, but of him walking tall, flanked by Marines, a symbol of enduring honor finally and rightfully acknowledged. If stories like Arthur's move you, and if you believe in honoring those who've served, subscribe to Hidden Sparks for more narratives that uncover the hidden courage around us. Remember to always treat everyone with respect. You never know the battles they fought or the greatness they conceal. Type honor if you stand with Sergeant Major Jenkins.